What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another AZ Aus video. In today's video, we'll be going over the comparison being made by some experts and people on television saying that the 2020 Arizona Cardinals are going to be the 2019 Cleveland Browns. Now, you can see on your screen the breakdown of this video. We'll be basically touching over a few different points I'd like to go over in terms of breaking down why I personally think this isn't a good comparison to make. So firstly, let's get right into it. Firstly, we'll just look at the head coach. Now, Freddie Kitchens, prior to being appointed the Cleveland Browns head coach, had never been a head coach. He had started his coaching back since 1999, where he was basically a position coach all the way up until 2018, where he was appointed the Cleveland Browns offensive coordinator. Prior to that, he hadn't had any sort of high level of, coaching or play calling experience. He was basically a positions coach. While he was with the Cardinals, he was a tight ends coach for majority of his stay, and also a quarterbacks and running backs coach. Now, in comparison to Cliff Kingsbury, yes, I understand Cliff was a head coach only in college, but Cliff was still a head coach for five years at Texas Tech. Prior to that, he was an offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach, and also a offensive quality control coach. Now, Cliff, like I said, it is a college-only head coaching position, but it's still being a head coach. It's still understanding, what needs to be done, daily duties of a head coach. Yes, the difference between the NFL and college is obviously you're monitoring young teenagers and young adults, where in the NFL you're managing over men and fully aged adults. So obviously it's not the exact same in terms of managing your personnel and players, but Cliff has head coaching experience. He's worked with multiple different quarterbacks, helped develop them. You can name the few yourselves. Johnny Manziel, won the Heisman. He was a complete bust. But Cliff's system made Johnny who he was. He didn't study the playbook. He wasn't that gifted of a thrower. He was more of a running first quarterback. Davis Webb, Patrick Mahomes, Baker Mayfield, Case Keenum, the list goes on. And now he's finally got his guy as well that he's been targeting for a very long time in Kyler Murray. So firstly, in comparison of just the coaching experience, I don't think it's a fair comparison to compare Cliff Kingsbury to Freddie Kitchens at all. Freddie Kitchens is now a tight ends coach for the New York Giants. So I guess that he not an offensive coordinator, not a quality an offensive quality control coach. He's a tight ends coach for the Giants. Cliff, when he got fired at Texas Tech, he was offered an offensive coordinator position at USC, which probably would have led to a head coaching position either in the NFL or again in college football. So first point, I don't think it's fair to even compare the two as head coaches. I think Cliff has way more experience, and it's even present in his first year as a head coach, where not at one point during the season did you see his players give up on him. They fought for Cliff for the whole season. A lot of players came out and said this was the most fun they've ever had playing, especially Larry Fitzgerald. It didn't even take him that long to say he was coming back. So yeah, I'll just wrap that up. I don't think it's a fair comparison to compare Cliff Kingsbury as a head coach who's had multiple years of head coaching experience to Freddie Kitchens, who had only 1 year as an offensive coordinator and 1 year as a head coach, and he's now been demoted back to a tight ends coach. And you can also see through the usage of personnel throughout the weeks. Cliff Kingsbury, between weeks 1 and 8, used a majority of 4 wide receiver sets. So he was using 10 personnel, 4 wide receivers, 1 running back, 42% of the time being for 216 plays. Now, you can see in the later weeks from weeks 9 to 7, Cliff Kingsbury adapted, reducing that number down to 20%, being 94 plays, which is more than half of a reduction. And you saw an increase from 15% to 32% in 12 personnel, which is basically 1 running back, 2 tight ends, and 2 wide receivers. You can see Cliff, and that went from 77 plays to 155 plays. So that's basically double. You can see Cliff adapted as he was going through the NFL. He was still learning his place in the NFL, still learning how to play he was still learning how to play calls in the NFL. You can see his most played set towards the end of the season was 11 personnel, being 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers. But it's important to note that he went from basically, he cut it in half, 4 wide receivers, 10 personnel. He cut that completely in half, started using more 12 personnel, as we saw. He started adapting, running the ball more, 2 tight ends, getting Max Williams more involved. Towards the end of the season, getting Dan Arnold more involved to great effect as well. And if we compare that to the Cleveland Browns, from weeks 1 to 8, they were stuck using 11 personnel, which is 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers. They were stuck in that personnel grouping, using that 75% of the time for 308 plays. Now, from weeks 9 to 7, that did go down, yes, to 44%, but if you look at it numbers wise, it went down from 308 to 246. That's not a big drop off there. You can see Freddie Kitchens was obsessed with running that personnel grouping, even though Baker Mayfield needed more help, he needed more protection. He needed something to change. Clearly, the tackles weren't holding up. But as a play caller, Freddie Kitchens did not change any of this, which obviously had a huge impact on the Browns. Baker was under pressure a lot last year. It obviously affected not only his stats, but also the team's the win-loss of the team. And you can see in the final personnel grouping for the entire season, the Cardinals sort of were between 11, 12, and 10 personnel, mainly skewed because of the early usage of the 10 personnel prior to Cliff changing it up. However, the Browns were 57% in the 11 personnel, which obviously they weren't changing in the season, which again comes back to my previous point, where you can't compare Cliff and Freddie in terms of their experience as play callers and their experience as head coaches. You saw, as the stats clearly show, and if you were a viewer, you could have seen this as well, that Cliff was adapting and changing as the season progressed, and the offense was really starting to look good in the latter weeks. Whereas Cleveland weren't changing their offensive personnel, and obviously it bit them. Baker's numbers going down, the offense of the team looking worse, and the tackles just not being able to hold up. So yeah, that's the second point I wanted to make. And just quickly, I'll make a point as well on the defensive coordinators. We all know who Steve Wilks is. We all know what Steve Wilks looked like as a head coach. Not saying Vance Joseph is an incredible defensive coordinator, an elite defensive coordinator. He's not. But we all, as Cardinals fans, we all saw what Steve Wilks was. So bringing him in as a defensive coordinator, probably not a good idea. I'll just leave it at that. I don't think we need to go into too much detail there. And the third point I just want to touch on as well is the staff carryover. The Cleveland Browns, obviously a new staff, new coaches, new scheme coming in, whereas the Cliff Kingsbury scheme's coming back in year 2. Majority of the offensive players were brought back. The defense upgraded. We brought in some, maybe not elite players except for Isaiah Simmons, maybe not some elite players on defense through a draft and free agency, but definitely additions that will make this team better. And the offensive side, mainly all the players came back really, and we added DeAndre New-Hopkins, which is a huge addition. I can't stress that enough, how much of a huge addition that is going to be. I'll probably do a breakdown video of that individually prior to the season starts, so keep an eye out for that as well. And then we also added Josh Jones in the draft as well, who is the future at either left or right tackle. So I do think that the scheme as well, coming back for year 2, Kyler being more comfortable in that scheme, that's another reason why you can't draw this comparison, because the Browns, obviously, like I said, new coaching staff, new defensive coordinator, in comparison to the Cardinals, who are bringing back the exact same coaching staff and personnel, and also adding new pieces to both the offense and defense to improve both sides of the ball. Moving on to the next point, it is basically the teams the Browns beat in 2018. Now, the Browns did not beat a single playoff team that year except for the Baltimore Ravens. So I'm not sure why there was all this expectation coming in for the Cleveland Browns. People predicted them to go to the Super Bowl because they added OBJ. But like I said, they didn't beat any impressive teams. You know, they lost to the Saints. They lost to they drew with the Steelers. They lost to the Steelers. They lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They lost to the Chargers. Second time round, they lost to Baltimore. They lost to the Chiefs. They lost to Houston. You know, all these playoff teams, you know, strong teams, they were losing to, and they weren't really quite close games for a majority of them. But then they were giving Super Bowl expectations because they picked up a few players in free agency trades and the draft as well, which was just ridiculous. You know, the expectations that were set for the Cleveland Browns are not the same expectations being set for the Cardinals. The Cleveland Browns, some people had them not only winning the division, but also going to the Super Bowl, which was ridiculous. It was completely ridiculous. In comparison to the Cardinals, you know, we did have, a win against Seattle, who was at the time the number one seed in the NFC. We're battling for that number one seed in the NFC. We played the Niners close twice. Baltimore was a one-score game as well. Pittsburgh and LA also one-score games, and we should have beaten Tampa. If you go back and rewatch that game. Kyle's interception, I think it was Trent Sherfield who fell over. Max Williams dropping a ball on fourth down, which would have been a touchdown as well. So, but the Cardinals, like I said, their expectations, no one's predicting the Cardinals to go to the Super Bowl. No one's predicting the Cardinals to win the division. It's more of a prediction that they'll finish maybe second or third in that division, clinch a playoff spot, maybe that seventh wild card spot that's now been added. So I think in terms of who the Browns beat and who the Cardinals beat, quite similar in sort of the teams that they beat in both of those separate seasons, but the expectations were just completely blown out of proportion for the Browns. And I guess the expectations. No one's comparing or saying that the Cardinals are going to a Super Bowl, whereas people were saying the Browns were going to the Super Bowl that following year. So I guess that's another comparison that isn't fair or isn't just in making the two comparisons. Finally, I'd just like to move on and basically put in a final point in terms of player issues. Now, we saw multiple issues with the Cleveland Browns in terms of players allegedly demanding trades at halftime, demanding trades after the game, especially after the Cardinals beat the Browns. There was a lot of rumors swirling that Jarvis Landry had requested a trade over the sideline, was asking for a trade. The Myles Garrett incident with the helmet, the Browns, the amount of penalties they had, the Greg Robinson incident over the offseason as well. It's just not fair to compare the two. Under Cliff, there hasn't been any players wanting trades. There hasn't been any players doing that silly behavior on the field, and any off-field issues. They're not tolerated. It's a new look team for the Browns this year, which I think this year's Browns should be maybe given Super Bowl expectations over the previous lineup and previous coaching staff of the Browns. But I'll just wrap it up there. Like I said, in all the points raised, I don't think it's a fair comparison to compare the Browns and the Cardinals from previous year. The previous year Browns, the 2019 Cleveland Browns, to the 2020 Arizona Cardinals. Please do leave your comments down below. I'd love to hear what you say. There's been more and more comments on my videos lately, and I really do enjoy reading those and interacting with you guys. But until next time, please do take care.